I wanted to start, thinking back. I don't know a whole lot about where you grew up and what your upbringing was like. So I really wanted to hear about where you grew up, what kind of racial tensions there may have been at the time and the place, um, and what any of your experiences of race might have been during your formative years.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Levittown, New York, and my folks came out of World War II and purchased one of those Levitt houses for the grand sum of $8,000 back then. And I lived there until I was in high school. So as a child, I grew up in that environment. It was an all-white community. We had maybe a couple Italians and a couple Jews, but it was mostly a white WASP community. And the people who lived there, I had a great upbringing there, actually, because so many of our neighbors were also veterans of World War II. They had come out and had children after they were young couples, came out and had children right after the war. And so there were tons of kids for me to play with. So it was really wonderful. It was, however, all white, and I didn't really think too much of it at the time growing up, quite frankly. The the GI Bill was responsible for providing the financial backing for vets emerging from World War II. And it wasn't until, if you can believe, this past week, I'm in my 70s. It wasn't until this past week that I learned that the implementation of the GI Bill was egregiously discriminatory against people of color, veterans of color.
My husband and I were just talking about this last night, and he was having to outline the legal aspects of what you're about to talk about. And I knew of it, but didn't know the details. So please go on.
Right. Well, so for me, in terms of the upbringing I had, the GI Bill was just tremendous. I mean, so many of the people in our neighborhood were just indebted to that bill. But what happened apparently was that while it was a federally endorsed legislation, that the implementation of that bill was at the state's level. And so it was subject to all kinds of more localized discrimination and that type of thing. And actually, what I have come to learn very recently is that that GI Bill was a major impetus in actually drawing the income disparity between whites and people of color, because of the accumulation of property that happened after World War II. So, but of course, growing up, I was blind to all that. I didn't even really consider it. I just grew up and was happy.
Would you say that your parents would have even realized it, or was this something that was playing out sort of at the state government level, where they were sort of, manipulating things to get away with this type of discrimination?
Yeah, and we can argue, and I'm sure there have been whole theses done on the motivation behind the implementation of that bill. My folks grew up on Long Island, both of them, grew up pretty conservative. I'm kind of happy to say that after having kids, they changed rather radically in their political perspectives. They both have since passed. They were in their mid-90s, both of them, when they passed fairly recently. And my mom, who passed within the past year, was, an adamant anti-Trump person, and that represents quite a movement for her politically from when she was very young. But I think as they became more sophisticated and aware of what was going on in the world, they were basically good people, sensitive people, and they couldn't abide some of the discriminatory policies that were sanctioned from the government and implemented at the local level. And they certainly couldn't abide some of the current racist rhetoric that our society is victim to today.
And you were saying you just really learned about it in the last week because there's so much reporting right now about the history in our country that's really never been done before, or has been done but has been sort of buried and or not paid much attention to. So do you think your parents, having passed recently, would have been just getting that information themselves? I'm kind of getting at, the education system, our systems in America, and when we talk about systemic racism, that filters down to even knowledge, education, reporting, widespread information about things like this.
Right, and it's part of the whole fabric of the way we in this country treat marginalized people. And so I think that was a growing awareness on the part of my parents, and it was with me as well. Although I like to think of privilege as kind of a subtle, seductive force in our society. And I'll give you an example of that. I was at a conference when I was working for the UCC. So I was 50.
Church of Christ, by the way.
That's right, the United Church of Christ. I was on their national staff and was at a conference. And so I was 50, or I guess about 50 years old. And I was in this conference, and the Bible study was on the book of Joshua and the invasion of the Israelites in the land of Canaan. And the Bible study leader was talking about this in positive theological terms and that kind of thing. And there was a Native American woman in our group, and she at one point burst into tears and just made this impassioned kind of statement about how this biblical passage for her and her people was very, very destructive and very, very negative. And what was really interesting for me sitting there at the time was like, I didn't really get what she was talking about at all. Yeah. And I consider myself progressive and kind of stuff, but I also had a little bit of envy for her because I felt I didn't have that relationship to my identity, my whiteness. And she was impassioned about, as she said, her people. But it later became, kind of amazing to me that here I was 50 years old, and I really didn't understand or experience on a first-hand basis the sense of what privilege was, what racial identity meant to so many people in this country, and to me by default, in a way that I didn't really kind of understand or take the time to realize the implications of my privilege as a white person in this country.